The fluorescent lights hummed their endless metallic song as Ashley Cooper moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU corridor at 6 in the morning, pushing a crash cart with the kind of silent efficiency that made her invisible. Nobody watched her. Nobody needed to. She was just the nurse who got things done without asking questions, without drawing attention, without leaving a ripple in the still water of the hospital's carefully maintained hierarchy. Her scrubs were pressed with military precision. Her movements economical. Her eyes tracked every monitor in the hallway the way a sniper tracks a valley from 10,000 feet. The limp in her left leg was barely perceptible to anyone not trained to notice such things. A 7mm deflection in her gait. Compensation 5 degrees to the right. She'd learned to walk like this in Helmand Province 8 years ago, learned to distribute her weight so the shrapnel lodged in her femur wouldn't catch on her knee with each step. The pain was information. Pain was data. She'd stopped thinking about it years before she'd stopped feeling it. Inside her jacket lining, worn close against her ribs where no one could see it, lay a faded unit patch. Desert tan. Threadbare. She touched it sometimes when she thought no one was looking, her fingers finding the embroidered eagle and anchor like a blind person reading Braille. At the nursing station, she pulled up the chart for room 412. The patient's name was classified. His status was more classified than that. A Navy SEAL, mute from traumatic brain injury sustained in a helicopter crash 2 weeks ago. Unresponsive. Bradycardic. A case so medically complex, so neurologically devastating, that 20 doctors had already declined to treat him. 20. The number sat in his chart like an accusation. Too expensive. Too time-consuming. Poor prognosis. The reimbursement codes wouldn't justify the hours. At a hospital like Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh, North Carolina, that calculation was the one that mattered most. Dr. Sterling arrived at 7:15, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile floor like gunshots in the quiet morning. He carried a coffee from somewhere expensive, the cup bore the logo of a cafe that didn't open until 8, and wore a watch that cost more than Ashley's annual salary. His tie was silk. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. He moved through the ICU like a man who owned it, which in a way he did. The hospital administrator deferred to him. The board members golfed with him. The pharmaceutical representatives knew his preferences. He'd been at Oak Creek Memorial for 6 years and had built something that looked like a medical empire if you didn't look too closely at the foundation. He saw Ashley repositioning before in bed 3, a patient with severe cellulitis in her right arm. The insertion was a 20-gauge angiocath running normal saline with vancomycin drip. Standard setup. But Ashley's hands moved with a precision that made Sterling pause mid-stride. She didn't fumble. She didn't double-check. Her fingers found the catheter with the kind of certainty that came from muscle memory, and when she adjusted the tension on the securing tape, she did it with the exact amount of pressure to hold it stable without restricting blood flow. Someone who'd spent years starting fours in moving vehicles. Someone who'd done this thousands of times under conditions that made a hospital ICU look like a country club. Sterling's eyes narrowed. Not out of admiration. Out of recognition. Recognition of a threat. He'd been watching her all week. She'd arrived on a Monday with no references, no phone number on file, no social media presence. Her hiring paperwork listed previous employment at a VA hospital in Seattle, but when Sterling's assistant called, the number was disconnected. That should have been a red flag. That should have triggered a deeper background check. But the agency that placed her had called it routine, and Sterling had been too focused on the quarterly billing cycle to push back. Now he watched her chart vitals with a nurse's competence that somehow suggested something deeper. Military bearing. Situational awareness. The way she positioned herself so she could see 3 monitor screens and the hallway entrance simultaneously. Sterling moved to the charting station and pulled up the hospital supply invoices. Everything he'd built depended on very specific relationships with very specific vendors. The medical supply company that provided their 4 pumps charged premium rates. The kickback arrangement was simple. they overbilled for equipment, and Sterling received a percentage in unmarked transfers to an offshore account. It was a system that had worked for 3 years without anyone noticing. 3 years of 6-figure bonuses. 3 years of building toward his exit strategy: retire at 55, consult for the pharmaceutical industry, become the kind of doctor who shaped policy instead of the one who actually treated patients. But nurses were supposed to process orders without reading them too closely. Nurses were supposed to do what they were told and keep their heads down. At 8:40, Ashley appeared at the nursing station with a clipboard. She was holding an invoice printout. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and carefully deferential. "Dr. Sterling, I had a question about supply ordering. The pump replacement for room 7 came through as premium grade at $800, but the equipment looks identical to the standard model we use in rooms 3 and 9. Both were billed the same date. I just wanted to confirm if that was intentional before we processed it for payment." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm in the background. Sterling's eyes met hers. He was smiling, but his jaw had tightened just slightly. "The premium model has upgraded firmware," he said. His voice was calm. "Controlled. Dangerous. Better monitoring protocols. Fewer alarms. Quieter operation for patient comfort." Ashley glanced at the invoice again. "The serial numbers are consecutive," she said, "which would suggest they came from the same manufacturing batch. If they're from the same batch, the firmware should be identical." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked closer to her, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something that sounded almost like a purr. "You know, when the nursing agency sent your file through, I noticed something interesting. They didn't include references. No previous supervisors. No contact information. In fact, your entire work history seems to have some significant gaps." Ashley's expression didn't change. "The VA system uses centralized records," she said. "Transition paperwork sometimes takes time." "It does," Sterling agreed. He was still smiling. "It certainly does. But you seem very confident about our supply chain management for someone who's been here exactly 8 days. He turned away before she could respond, moving back toward his office. Behind him, he didn't see Ashley set the clipboard down with careful precision, her hands perfectly steady. He didn't see the way she touched the inside of her jacket, her fingers finding the unit patch the way a prayer bead is found in a rosary. He didn't see her jaw tighten just slightly, not fear, not trembling, but the kind of controlled restraint that comes from someone who'd learned long ago that showing weakness in front of a predator only accelerated the attack. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It made it clear that Dr. Sterling had made a mistake, though he didn't understand that yet. Ashley had questioned the invoices once. She'd done it politely. She'd done it without accusation. She'd done it in a way that was almost apologetic, almost deferential. But she'd done it directly, in front of witnesses, and she'd used the language of someone who understood financial systems at a level that went beyond nursing credentials. That language had a particular shape to it. That language belonged to someone who'd been trained to identify corruption the way a bloodhound identifies a scent. Sterling returned to his office and opened his laptop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as he opened the encrypted folder where he kept his backup records. 3 years of overbilling. $447,000. That was his exit fund. That was his retirement plan. That was everything he'd built at Oak Creek Memorial. He needed to know who this nurse really was. But first, he walked to the window of his office and looked down into the ICU. Room for 12 was visible from this angle. The mute seal patient. The one who'd been refused by 20 doctors. The one lying unresponsive, his chart gathering dust, his prognosis deteriorating by degrees. On his left arm, barely visible beneath the hospital gown's short sleeve, was a tattoo. Black ink. Military. A name written in the careful script of someone who'd wanted it to last forever. Ashley. The patient's name was classified. But the name tattooed on his arm wasn't. And for the first time, Sterling wondered if he'd made a second mistake. A much larger one. The ICU conference room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like stale coffee and the peculiar antiseptic tang that clung to every surface in Raleigh's largest trauma hospital. Ashley Cooper stood at the medication cart outside the double doors, counting supplies as she had every morning for 3 days, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. She didn't intend to listen. But the sound of Dr. Sterling's voice, that distinctive drawl that carried like a foghorn through hospital corridors, made her pause. "I'm taking bets," Sterling announced to the room, loud enough that his words reached the hallway where she stood. "Our newest nurse, what's your name again, sweetheart, doesn't make it through the week. Any takers?" 2 residents laughed nervously. The sound had that quality of forced compliance, the laughter of people afraid not to participate. Ashley continued counting syringes. 10 milliliter, 12 milliliter, 20 milliliter. The numbers kept her grounded. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't change based on who was watching. "I'll take that action," Richard Chen's voice, one of the board members. "100 says she's gone by Friday. You're on." Sterling's satisfaction was audible, a man who'd just secured something he wanted. $100 says this one folds like the last 3. Ashley's jaw moved once, a small clench, but nothing else. She had learned composure in a place where a single flinch could get you killed. A hospital bet about her quitting was not even a tremor on that scale. She finished the count, documented it with her characteristic precision, and moved on to the next cart. But that was only the opening move. The cafeteria at 11:56 a.m. on day 3 was nearly empty. Most of the staff had already cycled through, leaving behind the detritus of hurried lunches, plastic trays stacked haphazardly, chairs pushed back at odd angles, the lingering smell of institutional food that never quite resembled the pictures on the menu. Ashley sat in the corner table, the one facing the exit, the one where she could see the room. 3 patient charts spread before her, her turkey sandwich untouched beside them. She'd been reading notes on room 412 again. The mute seal. 20 doctors had refused him. She'd counted the rejection letters in his file. 20 different notations of patient too complex or unsuitable for our facility or simply declined, no reason given. But she'd read between those lines. Nobody wanted a case they couldn't fix. Nobody wanted a patient who couldn't communicate his pain, his needs, his fears. His left arm bore a tattoo, A. Cooper. Just those letters, faded into his tanned skin like they'd been there for years. The footsteps were casual. Approaching without announcement. Ashley had heard 1,000 footsteps like that, the sound of someone who didn't think they needed to announce themselves. Sterling appeared beside her table with the naturalness of a predator that had never encountered prey that fought back. His shoulder caught the edge of her tray. It wasn't subtle enough to be accident, not obvious enough to be provably deliberate. The physics of it worked perfectly in his favor. The tray tipped, coffee cascading across the table in a brown wave that soaked the patient charts in a viscous flood. Her sandwich tumbled to the floor, landing face down on the tile. The plastic tray clattered against the linoleum with a sound like a bell announcing a verdict. Every staff member in the cafeteria turned to look. "Oh, Christ, I'm sorry," Sterling said, his voice carrying that particular intonation that made the apology into an insult. He looked down at her with eyes that gleamed like wet stones. "Pick that up, sweetheart. That's more your speed than questioning my supply orders." Ashley took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from muscle memory, the kind you learned to take when your life depended on absolute control. She did not stand abruptly. She did not protest. She simply rose with the kind of unhurried grace that made Sterling's smile falter slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face that might have been recognition but disappeared before he could examine it. One tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She let it travel down her cheek and caught it with the ball of her hand before it could reach her chin, wiping it against her scrub pants without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her voice, when it came, was steady as surgical steel. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor." Some of them even survived. The silence that followed had texture. It pressed against the room like humidity before a thunderstorm. Sterling's jaw tightened. His hand reflexively moved toward his phone, fingers drumming against his thigh like he was already dialing, already making calls, already setting wheels in motion that he believed would crush her before the week ended. "Get back to work," he said quietly, and walked away. But something had shifted. Ashley could feel it in the way the other staff members looked at her, not with pity anymore, but with something more complicated. Respect, maybe. Or fear. She gathered the sodden charts, the ruined sandwich, the pieces of what Sterling had tried to scatter. The cafeteria smelled like spilled coffee now, acrid and bitter. The next morning, Sterling found her at the medication cart on the 4th floor ICU, where she was drawing up 2 milligrams of midazolam into a tuberculin syringe. The morning shift had just started, nurses and residents moving through their rounds like players on a predetermined stage. "You know what I love about Navy nurses?" Sterling's voice was conversational, the tone of someone making small talk, but pitched loud enough for the 12 people within earshot to hear clearly. "Oh wait. You weren't Navy, were you? Your references don't even exist. Makes me wonder what you're hiding, Florence Nightingale." He stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive that tried to mask the smell of ambition underneath it. Ashley's hands did not shake. The needle remained steady as she withdrew the medication. She didn't look up from her work. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than his, which somehow made it reach further. "Some records get buried with the people who earned them." The words hung there. Sterling's expression changed, a flash of something that might have been anger or might have been respect, the two emotions sitting so close together in his face that it was impossible to tell which one was winning. He watched her for 3 seconds longer than was comfortable, then smiled coldly and walked away, already pulling out his phone. What neither of them knew was that Janet Morgenstern's investigative firm was being contacted at that exact moment. What neither of them knew was that board member Richard Chen was about to receive a phone call about credential irregularities. What neither of them knew was that by lunchtime, Ashley would be summoned to her first interview, then her second, then her third, each one digging deeper into a past that existed only in places classified so deeply that the government itself pretended it had never happened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling had already started building her termination file, page by careful page, document by fabricated document, each one a brick in the wall he was constructing to bury her before she could bury him. He was a man who understood power structures, institutional leverage, the careful mechanics of destruction that left no fingerprints. And he had no idea, not yet, that he was about to encounter someone who'd spent 8 years learning how to disappear without a trace. The chart felt heavier than paper should. Ashley held it at 11 p.m., standing at the nurse's station with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in glass, reviewing the name again, Marcus Chen. 38 years old. Multiple traumatic injuries sustained in Helmand Province 8 years prior. Traumatic brain injury with expressive aphasia, the medical term for what the doctors called his silence problem. His cardiac rhythm on the telemetry monitor traced an irregular pattern across the screen, the peaks and valleys of his heartbeat telling a story nobody else seemed interested in reading. 20 doctors had reviewed his case. 20 had declined. Too complex. Recovery unlikely. A diagnosis-related group payment of $47,000 meant his hours of care would cost the hospital far more than it would ever receive. The math of modern medicine was ruthless that way. The strong survived. The unprofitable disappeared. Ashley's shift was supposed to end at 11. She didn't leave. She pulled a chair to the nurse's station and positioned it with a clear line of sight to room 412's cardiac monitor. The telemetry screen cast a pale blue glow across the empty desk. She'd been here 6 days. Long enough to understand that Dr. Sterling moved through Oak Creek Memorial like a man accustomed to unopposed motion, a force that expected the hospital to part before him the way water parts before a stone thrown hard enough. What Sterling didn't understand was that Ashley had spent 8 years learning how to move through hostile environments without being noticed. Invisibility had muscle memory. Invisibility had technique. At 11:16 p.m., Dr. Sterling appeared on the unit like he'd been summoned by her thoughts. He saw her immediately, the only figure at the nurse's station this late, and his eyes narrowed with the particular irritation of a man discovering something in his domain that displeased him. He walked toward her with a kind of measured pace that communicated absolute certainty of his right to demand her presence, her time, her compliance. His cologne arrived before he did, something expensive that smelled like dominance and country clubs. "Go home, sweetheart." Not a suggestion. A command wrapped in condescension. "That patient isn't worth overtime I won't approve." Ashley set the chart down with deliberate care and turned to face him. Her voice, when it came, was steady as a pilot's during instrument approach. His rhythms concerning. "I'd like to stay." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sterling's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the edge of the desk, and in that small gesture Ashley saw the exact moment his patience transformed into something colder. "That's not your call." Each word came out clipped, surgical. "I'm reassigning his care to the float pool. You're off his case effective immediately. In fact, you're restricted from room 412 entirely. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Doctor." She didn't ask why. Didn't protest. Didn't do anything except watch him turn and walk away, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm like a countdown. The restriction order appeared in the system 30 minutes later, logged through hospital administration. Senior charge nurse Cooper is not authorized to provide direct patient care to patient Chen, room 412. Effective immediately. Dr. Art Sterling, attending physician. But Ashley didn't leave the floor. She moved to the far end of the nurse's station, where she could chart documentation and maintain a clear visual on the telemetry monitor for room 412. The monitor was mounted on the wall with 6 other screens, each one tracking a different patient's heartbeat. Marcus Chen's was the one that wouldn't stop bothering her. The rhythm was off in a way that suggested something was building. Something was organizing inside his chest. The telemetry showed it as a subtle increase in ventricular ectopy, extra beats firing out of sequence, like someone tapping on a door frame trying to get attention. The attending cardiologist wouldn't be back in Oak Creek until morning. The float pool nurse assigned to room 412 was new, competent with routine care but not trained to read the early warnings that a body broadcasts before it stops. At 1:11 a.m., Ashley was still there. The unit had settled into the particular quiet of deep night, when hallway lights dimmed and patient rooms became islands of monitored existence. She was charting shift notes that she'd write anyway, should be written anyway, when the door to room 412 opened and the float pool nurse emerged, moving back toward the supply room. The monitor showed Marcus Chen's rhythm unchanged. Still concerning. Still that irregular percussion like knuckles against glass. At 2:06 a.m., the alarm screamed. Not one alarm. Multiple alarms, the cardiac monitor producing a sound like electronic panic, a noise calibrated to cut through sleep and denial and administrative policy alike. The telemetry showed his heart rate dropping. Pressure climbing. The numbers on the monitor told the story that Ashley's training recognized instantly: cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating around his heart, crushing it, preventing it from filling properly. His systolic pressure was falling, 72, now 68, and his heart rate compensating with speed that couldn't last. He was dying in room 412. He had maybe 15 minutes before his heart stopped entirely. The float pool nurse was already moving, calling for the charge nurse, calling for the attending. The call went out, code blue, room 412. Cardiac tamponade. 20 minutes to attending arrival. 20 minutes. Marcus Chen didn't have 20 minutes. Ashley stood. The chair she'd been sitting in scraped backward against the tile, a small sound that seemed enormous in that moment. She looked at the closed door of room 412. She looked at the monitor showing his blood pressure dropping, 62 now, 58, and she thought about the restriction order logged in the system. She thought about Sterling's voice in her head: "You're restricted from room 412 entirely." She also thought about a phi base in Helmand Province. She thought about 11 hours holding a perimeter after her entire unit was killed. She thought about carrying a man through smoke so thick you couldn't see 3 meters in front of you, moving by sound alone, by the weight of him in her arms, by the simple fact that he was still breathing and stopping wasn't an option. She walked toward room 412. The float pool nurse saw her approach and started to say something, but Ashley didn't stop. She pushed into the room where Marcus Chen lay, his chest rising and falling in shallow panicked breaths, his eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling. His arms were restrained to prevent him from pulling his own for. His cardiac monitor showed what looked like a train wreck, pressure dropping, rhythm destabilizing, a body in crisis mode. "I need a 14-gauge needle and a syringe." Her voice sounded different now, not deferential, not soft, just precise. "And a crash cart positioned outside." "Move." The float pool nurse hesitated for exactly 1 second, then moved. People didn't argue with that voice. The voice came from someplace that had learned command in environments where delay meant bodies left behind. Ashley found the landmarks on his chest through tactile memory, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. She'd done this before. Not in 8 years, but her hands hadn't forgotten. Her hands never forgot. The needle went in with a small hollow pop, and the fluid came out, clear, 30 ccs of it, then 40, pressure releasing like air escaping from a punctured tire. The monitor began to show change almost immediately. His systolic pressure climbing, 68, 72, 80. His heart rhythm steadying. The desperate compensation slowing to something that looked less like panic and more like survival. His stabilizing, the float pool nurse said, her voice thin with relief or shock or both. Ashley withdrew the needle and placed it on the tray with movements that felt mechanical, automatic, the body operating on procedural memory while the mind stood somewhere else entirely. She'd just violated a direct order from Dr. Sterling. She'd entered a room she was explicitly restricted from entering. She'd performed an invasive procedure without attending presence. In any court of hospital law, in any review of protocol, she had committed multiple infractions. She also just saved Marcus Chen's life. She turned and walked out of room 412 without another word. The float pool nurse was already calling the attending again, reporting the needle decompression, the fluid drainage, the patient stabilization. By the time Sterling's voice appeared in the hallway 3 hours later, demanding updates, demanding explanations, demanding to know exactly what had transpired in his absence, the attending cardiologist had already reviewed the telemetry data and confirmed the pericardiocentesis had been textbook perfect, the pressure released precisely enough to save his life without compromising his anatomy. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. At 2:06 a.m., the cardiac monitor in room 412 didn't whisper. It screamed. 3 short bursts, then a sustained wail that cut through the sleeping hospital like a knife through silk. Fluid. Pooling around Marcus Chen's heart. Cardiac tamponade. The kind of silent killer that collapses blood pressure in minutes, that stops the strongest men mid-breath. Ashley heard it from the nursing station 2 floors down, through closed doors, through walls, through the clinical restriction Dr. Sterling had written that morning barring her from that room. The sound traveled to her the way only sounds reach people trained to recognize death arriving. She moved without thinking. Muscle memory took over. The restriction didn't stop her feet. Protocol didn't slow her hands. 20 doctors had refused Marcus Chen over 3 weeks, 20 physicians who'd written in his chart that his case was too complex, too unrewarding, too likely to end in failure. 20 doctors who'd walked past his room and found reasons to be elsewhere. But Ashley had watched him from a distance, had seen the way his body held itself, had recognized something in the architecture of his pain that most people missed. She'd also seen the faded tattoo on his left arm. She'd seen her own name, written in ink, written in blood that had long since washed away. She didn't question it. She moved. Room 412 was dark except for the monitor glow. Marcus lay on his back, chest heaving, color draining from his face like someone pulling a plug. His pressure was dropping. 110/70. 95/60. The numbers were falling faster than breath. His lips had begun to turn blue at the edges. His eyes were still mute, still unable to speak, but they found her as she entered and something flickered there, recognition, maybe, or the last hope of a drowning man. "I know," Ashley whispered. "I've got you." She didn't wait for the attending. Didn't page the cardiologist. Didn't follow the chain of command that would have taken 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. She didn't have. Her hands were already moving. 18-gauge needle. Sterile field. The antiseptic smell sharp as winter air. She marked the insertion point, 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and her muscle memory whispered the angles, the depth, the exact pressure required. "Breathe," she told him, though his lungs were already working overtime. "Just breathe." The needle went in smooth as a thought. No hesitation. No tremor. Hands that had held lives together in Helmand Province, hands that had performed this exact procedure in field surgical teams under fire, hands that official records claimed never existed because the operations they'd participated in were supposed to stay buried, those hands didn't shake now. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this dozens of times in places the government said she'd never been. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. The needle drawing back fluid, dark and deadly, the accumulated pressure that had been strangling his heart. She worked by feel and training, by the knowledge that lived in her body even though it couldn't exist in any file. 10 milliliters. 20. 30. His pressure was climbing. 85. 90. 105. The blue tint was leaving his lips. His oxygen saturation was climbing, 88% now, 92, climbing toward normal. For minutes. That's all it took. Marcus's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment there was no restriction, no hospital protocol, no buried records, no classified past. There was only the simple truth of one person saving another's life. His hand moved, searching, and found her wrist. He held it like she was the only real thing in a world gone liquid. "You're okay," Ashley said. "Stay with me." His pressure stabilized at 120/75. Sinus rhythm. Perfect. His heart rate was dropping from 138 to 115 to 100. Breathing becoming less frantic, more controlled. Ashley withdrew the needle, applied pressure, secured a dressing, and documented everything with the clinical precision of someone who understood that paper trails mattered. By dawn, Marcus was stable. Actually stable. Genuinely stable. The attending cardiologist arrived at 6 a.m. to find his most critical patient breathing normally, pressure steady, conscious and alert for the first time in months. The attending stood in the doorway and looked confused, then looked at the chart, then looked at the night shift notes. There were no notes. Nothing explaining why this man was suddenly viable. No intervention recorded. No procedure documented. No explanation that made sense within the boundaries of what nurses were supposed to do. But that wasn't the worst part. At noon, Dr. Sterling walked into the ICU with security. He was smiling. The kind of smile that came from a predator who decided to claim its prey. Behind him came an investigator named Morgan Stern with a folder thick as a fist, her expression the neutral blank of someone being paid to destroy someone's career. "Ashley Cooper," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "We need to talk about your credentials." She already knew. She could see it in the way the nurses turned away, in the way security had come, in the way the investigator was opening her folder like she was revealing something perfectly terrible. 20 doctors, Morgan Stern said, reading from her report without looking up, have documented that this patient required immediate specialist intervention. 20 physicians who noted his condition was beyond standard nursing scope. And yet we have a procedure here, pericardiocentesis, a surgical intervention that requires physician authorization, performed at 2:06 a.m. with no attending present, no documentation of orders given, no explanation for how a registered nurse obtained a needle and accessed a patient who was explicitly restricted from nursing contact. Ashley didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Didn't defend herself. Fraudulent credentials, Sterling continued, handing her the termination papers. His satisfaction was a physical thing, radiating from him like heat from a radiator. Insubordination. Unauthorized procedures beyond the scope of practice. You're done here. She looked at the papers. Looked at Sterling. Looked at the security guard whose name was Wilson and who'd helped her find the break room on her first day. Wilson wouldn't meet her eyes. Hand over your badge, the investigator said. Ashley did. She entered her locker. She found the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she'd smuggled into Oak Creek Memorial on her first day, the one that reminded her who she'd been when the world still knew her name, and she held it for a long moment. The fabric was paper thin. The embroidered insignia had faded to ghost colors from 8 years of hiding. But it was real. It was proof. She put the jacket on and walked out through the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial, past the memorial wall honoring healthcare heroes, past the photographs of doctors and nurses who existed in official records, past the security checkpoint where Wilson handed her a box containing the remains of her professional life. No one stopped her. No one spoke. By 12:13 p.m. she was driving toward downtown Raleigh in her 10-year-old Honda, her hand still steady, her composure still intact, her invisibility still perfectly maintained. 3 hours later, she sat in the VA hospital waiting room on Fayetteville Street, waiting her turn among veterans whose wounds she used to treat in another life, in another name, in another world where the government couldn't erase you from existence. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and industrial cleaner. The chairs were plastic and hard. Through the windows, afternoon rain hammered the city like applause no one had asked for. She was invisible again. Just another patient on a plastic chair. Just another person staring at worn linoleum. Just another story the world had forgotten to tell. But 47 miles away at Oak Creek Memorial, a Pentagon line was ringing into the administrator's office. The administrator's office smelled of mahogany and expensive coffee gone cold. The call had come through at 3:44 p.m., routed through the Pentagon switchboard with priority clearance and 3 officials conferencing simultaneously. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. The voice on the line carried the weight of sealed records and classified operations, the kind of authority that made hospital hierarchies feel like children's games. Dr. Sterling arrived at 5 p.m. because the administrator had summoned him. Not requested. Summoned. He walked into the office with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, whose board connections and kickback arrangements had armored him against consequences for nearly a decade. He didn't see the Pentagon liaison sitting in the shadows. He didn't see the state medical board investigator. He saw the administrator and the CEO and assumed this was about the unauthorized procedure, about Ashley Cooper's insubordination, about loose ends being tied. The administrator closed the door. The lock clicked like a firing pin. That was the first sound that made Sterling's shoulders tense. Have a seat, Dr. Sterling. Not a request. Not his office anymore. They laid it out methodically. The supply company kickback arrangement. The inflated billing codes running through the ICU for the past 8 years. The pattern of pushing out competent staff, our nurses, residents, respiratory therapists, anyone who asked too many questions about the numbers. The figure was staggering. $247,000. The administrator slid a folder across the desk. Sterling's hand stayed steady, but the tremor started deeper, in the cage of his ribs. We've also reviewed your personnel decisions, the CEO said. Her voice had the precision of a surgical blade. Your documented pattern of hostility toward Staff Nurse Cooper began day 3 of her employment. You made a public bet she'd quit within a week. You humiliated her in the cafeteria. You barred her from patient care. The timing of your termination decision correlates suspiciously with her unauthorized life-saving procedure. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. The office walls seemed to press inward. Then the administrator pulled up the footage. 3:06 a.m. that morning. The server room. Sterling's face grainy but unmistakable, moving with deliberate precision through the security system, fingers flying across keyboards, attempting to access and delete the recording from the cafeteria. The footage of him knocking Ashley's tray. The footage of him walking past her table with the confidence of a man certain no consequences would follow. The footage of him in the supply room 2 weeks earlier, meeting with a representative from Precision Medical Solutions, the company whose inflated invoices had been flowing through his authorization for years. The screen went dark. That deletion attempt was made approximately 12 hours ago, the state medical board investigator said. Her name was Morgan Stern, and she had the calm demeanor of someone who'd built cases against physicians for 30 years. It triggered an automated alert to our IT department. This was the moment Sterling could have asked for his lawyer. He didn't. Your IT director preserved every frame, Morgan Stern continued. Every backup. And he flagged your deletion attempt to the hospital board and to our office simultaneously. Tommy Rodriguez, Marine Corps veteran, recognized certain things about Senior Chief Cooper on her first day. Decided to pay attention. The walls definitely moved. Sterling's vision narrowed to a tunnel. Senior Chief. Not nurse. Not just a nurse. That rank carried history. It carried weight that made the room tilt. The door opened. Tommy Rodriguez stood in the doorway holding a flash drive. He set it on the desk without speaking. His posture was ramrod straight, the bearing of someone who'd spent years inside a uniform. He looked at Sterling the way you look at something beneath your boots. Then he left. Your attorney will receive a copy, Morgan Stern said. The board members you contacted, Dr. Chen, Dr. Hartwell, and Dr. Morrison, have all recused themselves. Their involvement is under separate review. The outside investigator you hired has provided her files, which document explicit instructions from you to build a termination case against Ms. Cooper regardless of her actual clinical performance. Text messages. Email trails. Coordination records. Sterling's designer watch caught the fluorescent light. $6,000 at his wrist, and it suddenly felt like evidence. By 6 p.m., his personal lawyer arrived, a woman named Carlson who specialized in medical board defense. She took one look at the files and texted him a single sentence, "We need to talk about plea negotiations." By 7 p.m., the state medical board investigator had initiated a formal review. By 8 p.m., Sterling's medical license was suspended pending formal hearing. The board members distanced themselves within hours. Colleagues began declining comment. News alerts started appearing on his phone. Oak Creek Memorial investigation updates, medical board suspends physician license, hospital probe reveals billing scheme. His wife called at 10:17 p.m. He didn't answer. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when the SEAL team commander walked into the administrator's office at 11:43 p.m., still in uniform, carrying a classified file with a red border that made every civilian in the room sit straighter. He opened it once. Just once. Just long enough for Sterling to see the photographs. Ashley Cooper in desert camouflage, weapons-grade competence in her eyes. Ashley Cooper in official Navy portrait. Ashley Cooper with a Navy Cross ribbon on her chest. The commander read for sentences aloud. Then he closed the file. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper. 7 years of classified operations spanning multiple continents. 3 Purple Hearts. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. 1 Navy Cross for actions above and beyond the call of duty in Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley, during the Phi-Base Phantom operation. She saved 4 lives that day, including the life of SEAL Marcus Chen, the patient she was explicitly barred from treating. Sterling's face went the color of old linoleum. The kind you see in VA hospitals where the forgotten go to wait. She held a Phi-Base for 11 hours after her entire unit was killed, the commander continued. Then carried 4 wounded to extraction under fire. Her medical training was classified. Her presence at Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to be invisible. She was ordered to disappear. She complied. She became a nurse so thoroughly that 20 doctors refused to treat the patient she knew she could save. 1 nurse said yes to herself. 3 hours after you destroyed her career, the Pentagon called. Sterling drove home in his Tesla, watching his career implode in real time through his phone. By midnight, his medical license suspension was public record. By 1 a.m., the first national news alert went live. By 2 a.m., his hospital privileges were revoked across North Carolina. By 3 a.m., his wife had called her divorce attorney. He sat in his kitchen at 3:11 a.m., exactly 12 hours after the administrator's office had closed like a trap, and stared at a Google search, "How to fight medical board revocation." The answer required lawyers he couldn't afford and character witnesses he no longer had. The answer was no. 6 months later, a small community college classroom in Durham held 15 students learning CPR on plastic mannequins. Dr. James Sterling demonstrated chest compressions in a polo shirt instead of a white coat, minimum wage instead of 6 figures, anonymity instead of authority. No one asked about his past. His past was a file that had been sealed and filed away in the same vault where classified operations live. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper stood in dress blues, her Navy Cross hanging around her neck 8 years late, the faded unit patch that had spent years sewn inside her jacket lining finally retired to a shadow box. Marcus Chen stood beside her in his own dress uniform, his daughter Emma crying quietly, the commander reading the citation aloud in a secure room where every redacted word was finally spoken. Ashley's hands didn't shake. They never had. They never would. Outside, November sun set over Arlington. 3 hours. That's all it took to change everything. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven the doubters wrong, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below, what would you have done if you held a secret that could change everything? We read every single comment. Thank you for watching.